Hello everyone, welcome to For Nor to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. We talk quite a bit about how reality informs categorization, and even how categorization may also affect reality. This often leads us into some difficult dialectical terrain when discussing topics, particularly those with murky linguistic properties. One such area in which the titans of philosophy have experienced the same issues as your humble hosts is in morality and ethical reality. Today, we're going to discuss whether a possible solution lies in examining the issue under the paradigmatic auspices of quantum mechanics. All right, so I struggled a little bit because we have not had our normal warm-up this morning.
No, we haven't, but it's a fine and literate start.
I'm listening to my voice and my pronunciation of the words, and I go, I could have used that hour pre-show discussion that we have.
That's my fault for being a volunteer for a public library, and we're having a book sale, and I have to go back and sort books, which is fun, but you know, I pushed us, so sorry for not the warm up.
No, that's all right. We'll power through it. So this episode is based off of a really cool article that you sent me, and then I've found a couple other articles that seem to indicate that philosophers and psychologists and others are thinking along the same lines. So I said, well, this will be something that's worthy of examination.
Absolutely.
Which is this episode or this article written by King and King.
Yep. Ian King and Miles King.
Talking about how there seems to be a possible relationship between quantum mechanical laws and morality, if you look at it from the right way. So let's start out by saying, what will we mean when we use the term quantum morality?
Well, that is the foundational question for this episode. And having read that article just this week, but having read a Psychology Today article very recently as well, within days, essentially what it seems to mean is that we have to take 4 or 5 principles of how we as lay people can understand something about quantum physics and apply it to whether or not it affects moral laws. In other words, for a long while, well, for as long as Newton stuff has affected us, Newton's research on the laws of physics and so on, so a few hundred years, people have sought, well, Jeremy Bentham sought to do it, Immanuel Kant sought to do it, and therefore lots of others, to somehow do an algebra of morality. Yeah.
So they call that physics envy, right?
Physics envy, which is
interesting, right? Because it's when they laid it out in the article, I go, it seemed clear as day, but I really hadn't thought about it much until it was mentioned. But I go, oh yeah, I guess that in a way, Isaac Newton did shake up history and the way that philosophers and scientists, empiricists, think about reality.
Yeah, and I have a side phrase that I have modified because of this article. I never called it business envy, but that's really what so much of my profession, what has downgraded the work of people in the humanities generally is somehow it doesn't have a cachet of relevance to the administrative elements of the academic world unless it's empiricized and business focused. So it's business envy or empiricism envy in that case, but it's related. It's if you feel like you have to somehow shift an entire set of studies to make them more scientific because the scientific paradigm is the thing, then you're going to have probably trouble. And that's what this article is about.
Yeah, and I think that, the business envy, that's another good one, and that affects almost everything just as well. If you look at education, right?
Yes.
The humanities are the obvious one. And again, it doesn't even have to be in the field of education, but education has done it to the point of, okay, well, you're going to come and get this degree and this is how you're going to make money with it. But even outside of that, you see, there was an article, I sent you an article yesterday, I think, talking about ChatGPT, and in our episode when ChatGPT was new, one of the things I raised was, do you think it's unethical for these models to be trained up on literary works that are meant to be, consumed, but not necessarily used in this manner,
Mm-hmm. And it's a fine article.
Yeah, and we talked about that. Now there's a lawsuit from authors that are saying, hey, when we wrote these books, we never intended them to be learning material for this type of intelligence. And I think in our episode when we talked about it, I think that you said that you didn't think it would be a problem because the machine technically isn't doing anything that the humans aren't doing, right? You and I would read a book and then we'd talk about it with other people and we'd come to conclusions and we'd create something new out of it and it'd make something new.
I was naive and wrong. That's my introductory phase to just about everything. What's wrong? And I was naive and I was hopeful. And no, and this is all of this concatenates, all of this relates, and it's been spinning around in my head with these things we've been sending each other this week, because there's another piece that I read, and it's related to what we're talking about today, about the 5 possible ways that AI could very simply get rid of us. And they're elegant and therefore frightening. And in the sense of, and the alarms are going up all over the place about we can't, as if we could, the arrogance in even saying it, we can't let it grow as fast as it's growing. That's ridiculous. We let that out of the bag. That talk about Pandora's jar from last week. It is out of the jar. It is not going back into the jar.
And I think the important thing that ties us in is that why is it out of the jar? It's out of the jar because of business envy, right? You have all of these AI developers calling for a halt to AI development, but they're the same ones that continue to develop it because they want to have the leg up on the other guy. They want to be able to introduce the new product, right? That society needs.
So they're essentially reaching out in coy. I find it coy and disingenuous for the elite of the developers to say, "Oh, help us, do something, put shackles on us, lawmakers, because otherwise we're going to do something terrible." Yeah. It's like an Oscar Wilde play. And at the same time, they're going, "Oh, let's have threads. Let's take down Twitter. It's just amazing." We're not putting it back in the jar. And we're not going to limit AI to, "Oh, you can only learn this much." When does that ever? We have social forces now that are trying to limit what people can learn. It's not turning out so well.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen with AI. So yes, I was naive and wrong because the quantum element. We talk quantum computing, the ethical and morality issues having to do with quantum computing are very much wrapped into this. When you have the capacity, the unknown capacity, the Schrodinger-like mystery of what can be learned, what can be generated, how of course it's going to affect moral principles and laws. So, because as the article says, as the King article says, moral. Ask the question: Are ethics, are moral laws equitable with planetary motion laws? And no.
Yeah. This is, it's interesting because so there's a lot going on here, right? We're talking about the morals, ethics and morals regarding AI developers, ethics and morals regarding the use of artistic and humanities endeavors, and how they're usurped by business models, how they're constrained and sort of limited by educational institutions trying to make them business models, but also by education and philosophers trying to, through physics envy, trying to make them scientific, make them empirical, make them systematized in a way similar to what Newton did to physics.
Yeah.
But the interesting point to make is that Newton was not the be-all, end-all of physics. And so this idea that, Newton came along and created calculus and defined all the motions of the universe, and suddenly humanity took this gigantic leap forward. None of that is false.
No.
But Einstein came with relativity, and then after him, he denied quantum mechanics, which was a natural extension of his work. But others came along and said, no, this is legitimate, and started talking about it. And now, sure, we still use Newtonian laws, especially at the large level to look at things that are fairly regular. But quantum mechanics has opened an entire can of worms that really informs us about the nature of reality in a way that would be impossible to understand in a Newtonian framework. So this idea that we're going to try to find a way to make the humanities or make ethics or morals systematized out of physics envy is very, very misguided. So, and I'll have to admit, I have been naive and wrong, right, about ethics and morals. When we think about, I have a philosophy podcast, so this isn't something that I like to advertise, but ethics and morals have usually been the least interesting part of philosophy to me. And the reason was, I guess I always looked at it and I saw that all the major philosophers had developed these frameworks, and it seems like almost all of them had pretty obvious fatal flaws where you go, well, that doesn't work. That doesn't make sense. And in some part of my mind, I go, well, it's all relative, so I don't even know if there's a point in really talking about it. That's a terrible viewpoint for a philosopher to take. And this article really sort of
gave you a kick,
put that right in my face, said, this isn't worth thinking about? Well, look at this. So
I have always been fascinated with ethics. So we start from different positions, but this article very much puts it in one's face inescapably. Mm-hmm. And I, as we keep talking, I'm going to keep going back to that example of, there's so many examples one could use, but of an AI developer saying, you must stop us. It's akin to a college, any college, wanting to get customers and so advertise, you can have a college degree while you're getting a high school degree. Well, maybe, and sure, you can get a degree that says that, but were you given a college education? Arguably not.
Yeah.
But it's what the public wants, and so the public's saying, don't rock the boat about this. Okay. Education ultimately depends on how much you put into it yourself and what resources you use and what questions you ask and how much you read. And so I defy anybody who wants to say that they got a college education in high school to push really hard on that. How many questions did you ask? How deeply did you push? How much did you read? And leave it to you to make that your own decision about that. But if it was about going out there and getting a job, okay, fine. But that's not. But that itself is an ethical issue. So here we have the idea that we are being asked, is something is right, is it right always?
Yeah.
And putting that on with the idea of quantum entanglement, where a particle at this side of the universe and a particle at the other side of the universe will behave in exactly the same way. And so does a rule that we have. Do we accept that it's a rule that everybody has in the same circumstance, no matter what part of the planet you're on?
Yeah, so let's walk through them.
Yeah.
So we'll discuss the 5 clues that Ian and Miles King used
Mm-hmm.
to equate morality with quantum mechanics. So the first one they have, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase these to make them easier and shorter for the listeners to understand. But the first one kind of essentially says labeling something right or wrong passes that judgment on to the past and future actions. And so that's sort of the moral or ethical viewpoint. And the quantum mechanical counterpart is entanglement, which is this idea that out in the universe, there are 2 particles that are created that are linked together. And regardless of the space or time between them, changes to one affect the other one. They do not have to abide by the laws of the speed of light, because technically they're not traveling, they're communicating, and they're linked, but they do not have to abide by that law. So what do you think about that one?
Well, I think it's very first, just as a generator of examples, it's clear that this idea of entanglement works. If we take, without naming specific names, but if we take the idea that a police officer offers a narrative of something that happened that didn't happen that way at all and kills somebody, when all the evidence, visual and oral, points to that was not necessary. Well, that happened in our country. It happens in our country. It's happening in France right now, and the responses on both sides of the Atlantic are and have been similar. And the responses of leadership in both nations have been similar. Shh, calm down. This is attributing factor is not because of bad policing. It's because of other social factors. In France, they're blaming it on video games, which is patently. How many times has it been proven that it isn't proven at all? There has been no empirical, for the empiricists who love this, link between watching and playing video games and going out and becoming a shooter. And if it were, it wouldn't be the kids watching the video games. It would be the police officers who are doing the shooting. But of course, we're not talking about that. Both sides of the Atlantic, a slightly different space-time, but I think indicative of just one small example.
Yeah, I thought that's an interesting one. And I think it's one that we won't really be able to flesh out till we look at some of these other clues.
Right.
But we can start with just the broad strokes, and ask the questions like, so in that case, we consider that one murder, right? So if we say murder is wrong, essentially what the Kings are saying is, okay, well, if you make that sort of moral judgment right now, what you're saying is that murder has always been wrong and murder always will be wrong. Therefore, your judgment in this time is entangled with judgments of morality in the past and in the future.
And it becomes a kind of Kantian universal. That's where it's interesting.
Yeah, and so we can see the problems that this creates that they're going to address in the next clues, which is that what I just said is much more broad than what you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it creates a lot more issues because murder, right? Murder could be a police officer killing an innocent person. It could also be a soldier killing an enemy combatant. It could be the state executing somebody for committing some other kind of heinous crime. So this idea of killing has a lot of ethical things that are predicated on the situation.
Yes.
And so when we're trying to determine these things, it's hard to just use a overlapping or, just a broad overarching statement about something. There has to be a lot of context with it generally.
Yes.
So that leads us to our second clue, which is right and wrong can only be attributed to actions, intentions, and outcomes, among a few other, very narrowly defined things. Mm-hmm. And the quantum mechanical principle that this coincides with is fundamental particles. So you have quarks and leptons and gluon, like all these different subatomic particles that basically, what quantum mechanics is saying is, that there is fundamental particles, right? It doesn't just keep going on forever. There are things that make up other things.
Yes.
And so in quantum morality, what the equivalent would be is saying, well, everything's not relative. You can look at something and make an ethical or moral judgment as long as you are defining what that foundational thing is. What is the intent of the person? What is the action of the person?
And intent and actions must be separated from, and they point that out very well, from things that are morally neutral. Objects are morally neutral. So it moves us toward nature.
Yeah,
so morally neutral. So we'll get to that, but this is where that starts.
Yeah, we might as well do clue 2 and 3 together because I think it's hard to talk about them separately. So 3 is ethics can only work if actions, intentions, and outcomes, those foundational, fundamental aspects, are regarded independently of each other. And the quantum mechanical correlate to that is particle duality, right? This idea that when you look at light, we know that light is a wave, but we also know that light is a particle. And so those two things seem to be contradictory or mutually exclusive, but we have experimental evidence, strong experimental evidence both ways. And there's even experiments that can show in the same experiment that it is both a wave and a particle. So there's this thing where you go, okay, well, light is a single thing, and yet it has these two properties. And so in quantum morality, they're saying, oh, okay, so morality is this one thing, but it has these separate aspects that seem to be mutually exclusive.
And so they call it a single realm or a single dimension. So when you take a Benthamian, Bentham-esque situation about the happiness of the greatest number. You're talking about an outcome. Okay, fine. But when you start bringing in the intention of the actor, the agent, or the state of mind, or the action itself, then it gets really complicated. Oh, any action is okay to make the greatest number happy? No.
Yeah, and this is where I lost interest in a lot of ethical and moral philosophy, is because the authors bring up some of the key examples that foil these paradigms, right? If you have a utilitarian, or Bentham-esque viewpoint, you say, oh, okay, well, it's just the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And the example the authors use is, oh, okay, well...
Or the hedonistic, even the happiness of the people. Happiness.
Right. So if it makes 40,000 people happy to watch two people battle to the death, then is that morally right? And, there's part of me that always says, well, obviously not. So this is wrong. So there's no point in thinking about it, right? Move on to the next one. Or, the other one, if intentions, right, are it, then you can go, oh, okay, well, maybe somebody intended to do good and then committed genocide, Well, was that morally? No, obviously not. So I've always struggled reading moral philosophy because, if in metaphysics or epistemology or ontology, even if an author doesn't get anywhere, firm, it gives you something to think about, and it could be right even though you couldn't prove it. But with ethics and morality, if you're not right, it's pretty obvious that you are not right.
Well, you would think so, but think of the time in which we are living.
Right, and this is where, and this is where these two rules come together, right? To tie together is that what they're saying is with quantum morality, you can't think of all these things together. You can't say that the actions and the intentions and the outcomes all have to be right, because it's very hard to define a scenario where those things, not a scenario, you could define a scenario, but it's hard to define a patterned way of approaching life and reality where all three of those things always line up a certain prescriptive way.
Yeah.
And so you have to, in order to develop a moral philosophy, you have to look at one at first. That's the rule number 2 is you have to look at one. And rule number 3 is you have to look at one independently of the other ones. So
and then you find the inconsistencies, and then the inconsistency should cause you to rethink your ethics.
Yeah.
That's where it leads.
Right.
Right? So you first to separate these things so that you can figure out what you're talking about, your intentions, your actions, your state of mind, or the outcome. But the moment you stop and start looking at those things, you are, one hopes, rethinking and reevaluating. And that is the crux for me right now in American society, planetary society too. But I have this is the obvious hypocrisy of positions. There is a person this week who is speaking on behalf of her spouse running for president and saying his main goal is to protect our children, and our children need to be protected no matter what. And of course, my thought was, then be quiet and back off, because your attempt to protect your children is putting my children at risk.
Yeah.
And if you back up, lady, and think about that for a minute and apply this kind of reasoning to it, you might notice your own hypocrisy or inconsistency, which we all have, and rethink and step away from the abyss.
Yeah, so it raises this really interesting question, right? And I think that's what part of this quantum morality, which is a term that I coined. They don't mention that in the article.
No, but it's a good term.
Yeah. Well, so we're sticking with it. But so I think that's the interesting thing that the quantum morality raises, is that much like physics envy, right? Newton was able to develop these universal laws that work very well for the universe. And other empirical and unempirical areas have attempted to use that same format with essentially zero success, right? People have tried to develop mathematical laws for all kinds of fields, and it just hasn't panned out as well as it did for Newton. And then on top of that, like we discussed earlier, Newton was not the be-all, end-all with physics. Quantum mechanics came along and said, oh, okay, well, here's how things actually work. So when we're thinking about morality and ethics, do you think that it's impossible to come up with a system that can be applied universally? Do you think that morality and ethics is always based on the context, on specific things? Do you think that that interaction between actions, intentions, and outcomes is always going to be unstable and chaotic in a quantum-esque way that will cause it to, a time, in one situation, you may apply these intentions, actions, and outcomes, and in another situation, you may apply the opposite ones and still have a coherent moral or ethical framework?
There are a lot of questions that you've embedded in that wonderful narrative question. I think that a universal ethics is unachievable by humans as we have known them from the moment that we find history developing. Because of our inconsistencies, our quantum inconsistencies, and because of some of the paths that we choose, or the illusion of choice happens, and the very deterministic nature of what we are leads us to these inconsistencies. But I think that the universal is that we keep thinking, if we keep thinking about them, if we keep actively engaging with them, because of the changing nature of being itself, the changing ontological reality, let's say, the rules will keep changing because we gain knowledge. When we refuse to gain knowledge, the rules aren't going to change, and we see how badly that goes. When we gain knowledge, we necessarily rethink conditions. That's frightening for a lot of people who don't want anything to change. To want nothing to change is to go back to a pre-Socratic view of the universe, where there is no motion. Everything is only made of one thing. Quantum sometimes heads toward that part of it, but everything's static. There's no room for motion. That seems to be what numbers of people want. It's untenable. It's unsustainable, to use that phrase that we use so often now. So there's something you sent this week that points to this. You sent me, I forget where you clipped it from. It was an excerpt which talked about things such as, look at how oil use change. Look at what happened, how using oil helped us preserve whales for a while, saved them from extinction, except that then we got into fishing and whale meat and
yeah.
So where was that from?
Yeah, so that was from a book I've been reading called Power Trip. And the point that he made was, the world ran on whale oil, and we hunted them almost to extinction. And then petroleum was found, and we were able to replace all the whale oil products with petroleum, therefore saving the whales. But then oil spills and the effects, the environmental effects of petroleum are now killing the whales. Or with forestation, right? So we were deforesting the entire planet because we were using so much wood to power our stoves and to heat our buildings and things. And then coal was found, and coal was much more clean and efficient, and that allowed the forests to regrow and that sort of thing. But now coal also has had environmental impacts that are causing forests to struggle. So that's a very good example, right? Should we say that it's immoral to use coal or oil? No, because at one point in time, it was the correct decision in order to save the planet.
But it wasn't a universal and always practicable position.
Exactly. And so that addresses the question that I was asking, which is that is there a universal or moral ethical code that you could live by?
Yeah, there may well be, and that is to always rethink the code.
Yeah, because and we're simplifying it here by just using actions, intentions, and outcomes, because there are other things that play into it. But I think it just creates a simple enough picture that it allows us to talk about it in a coherent way, and it does cover the properties of it. But basically, if you can assign right or wrong to either one of those three conditions, and you can think up a scenario where it would be moral or ethical to do so. You could have a bad intention, bad actions, but have a good outcome, and it could be a moral thing. Or you could have good intentions and good actions and a bad outcome, and it could be a moral thing. Yeah. You can go all the way down the list. I had an example of this just yesterday. I was going into work, and as I was approaching the door on the concrete pad, I saw some ants in a death spiral. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's where a lead ant who's trying to find food is putting out a pheromone for other ants to follow him. But he loses his way and starts just walking around a circle. And so all the ants that are following him start walking around a circle. And eventually they'll just die in a pile because they will have gotten lost. The lead ant will just be in the middle and the rest of them will just start. So I see these ants forming this spiral. I know what it is. And I, without really thinking about it, just stepped on that pile and smeared it. Because I wanted to save the other ants that were in a line down the way from following them in this spiral.
Okay.
And I walked inside. And then the article that we've been reading and all the thoughts that have gone through my head go, was that the right thing to do? Right? I just wiped out a few dozen ants in one step without giving it any consideration, right? Destroyed life. So my intentions were good. I wanted to save the rest of the ant colony.
So you did give it consideration. You didn't do it without consideration. Without consideration would be, I hate ants.
Right.
No, that's not what happened.
So I had good intentions. I wanted to save the ant colony. The action itself, right? I would say the action itself is bad. Like I took life. So if you take the intention and the outcome out of the equation, you just look at the action. I think the action is evil, right? Killing. But then the outcome, when I left work, there were no ants in sight. So it broke the line. They did go, the ones that survived did end up going to do something different. So I would say intention good, action bad, outcome good.
Yes,
right.
There's your calculus. But what does that accomplish for you? To say, oh, okay.
Now I should apply that calculus across. That should be my ethical code, right? From now on, I should do the right thing, or I should want to do the right thing, even no matter what it takes, which is bad actions, right? In the hope that there will be a good outcome.
You're seeking the impossible fusion of deontology and consequentialism, which we all find our way into. But this is where the quantum Heisenberg's principle.
Yeah, and that's the next one, which is clue number 4 is merely considering ethics affects the problem of morality, right? And so the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is, essentially the quantum mechanical correlate is if you know the position of something, you can't know its velocity. And if you know its velocity, you can't know its position. So in this case, with ethics, it's if you know, just thinking about the problem of ethics affects the problem of ethics.
I'm going to use an example from nature that I experienced yesterday as an intrusive human who does not know what effects he had, but noticed some ripples. I was in a momentarily grim contemplative space. I was walking out along my fields, paths that I've created, and I heard this really insistent alarm. It was a bird, but it was obviously in great distress. And I was looking around, and at first I took out my phone and used my Merlin app. It's not advertisement, but I think most of us know what Merlin is. It was a catbird. And then I heard a telltale scree of a red-tailed hawk. And I'm looking around, and up near a power pole at the other side of the fields, I see this hawk pursuing this little bird. So I used technology at a whim, as a guess, as a wondering. I'm curious. So I was being a human interventionist, and sought very quickly in my phone a red-tailed hawk call, and I put it on full volume and I held it up, and the red-tailed hawk stopped pursuing the bird, did a sweep around near where I was. The catbird then came swooping around and started to try to attack the red-tailed hawk. I think, okay. And so then I played it again. They both separated. The red-tailed hawk hightailed it across the field, and the catbird stopped making its sound. And a moment after that, about 30 yards away from me, I heard a stomp, and it was a deer. And then the deer got really exercised and was stomping and huffing again. I'm thinking, all right, is that as a result of having a hawk sound really near the top of the field grasses where the phone was? And so, I don't know what I did.
Yeah, and
I had the intent, of helping a creature in distress that I'm not even sure what the distress was, and maybe the catbird had been trying to attack the red-tailed hawk all along.
Yeah, and so I think we've all had this experience, like watching a nature documentary, right? We all see, oh, okay, oh, wow, that's a cute animal, right? And then that animal gets eaten by a lion or something. Yeah. And we all get sad. We go, wow, why did they have to show that? Or, we're all rooting for the animal to get away. But the thing is, if that animal gets away, the lion doesn't eat, right? And then the lion dies. So what's the morality there?
There isn't a morality, and that's the whole point. With supposedly good intentions, and maybe not even justifiably that, maybe just sheer curiosity. I was in a place of mind where I wanted to try to do something with another circumstance. I couldn't do anything at all.
Yeah.
Got to take action. Okay. And that's not necessarily justifiable either. And I set up perhaps some ripples that weren't intentional. So then I took myself back to a stone step stoop at my house, and I just sat there and listened to the woods. And the huffing stopped, and the bird songs all started again. But the very fact of having stepped into that. And then there's a second thing, and I was reading about this morning, where there's worries about shark attacks in Long Island right now. 5 people have been seemingly bitten by sharks over the course of this very early summer, which statistically is a bit of an anomaly, but overall, with all the people in the water and all the statisticians are saying, the shark experts are saying, stop it. Yes, randomly, by chance, there are going to be a few of these things. But what's happening is that they're trying to train lifeguards to watch for sharks, and they're sending up drones, and they're putting lifeguards on these. It's not a jet ski, but it's something akin to that. I forget the name of the product. And an expert the shark expert in the state was commenting and saying, stop this. You are kidding yourselves. And so this is probably an attempt to just make the public feel safer. Mostly you can't see shark activity with a drone because mostly sharks aren't in extremely shallow water. I didn't know this, but I'm reading about this, right? And this expert, secondarily, when you're zipping around on a jet ski, you're not going to see a shark. Thirdly, lots of people see bottles in the water floating. Or dolphins, and so what he said, this is the crux of it. He said, perception is reality for human beings.
Yeah.
That's quantum. What we think we see is what we tell ourselves we see.
Yeah. Yeah. And that goes back to what I was saying in the intro, which is, how categorization informs reality and reality informs categorization, right? It's this loop where really the stories we tell ourselves become our reality, right? And so if you see a bottle in the ocean and you think it's a shark, you're going to tell your friends for the rest of your life that you saw a shark. And that's going to be real to you. It's one thing to lie about it and to know that in the back of your head. It's another thing to see the bottle and be convinced that it's a dorsal fin and then have that be something that you say. And undoubtedly, we all have these things.
We convince ourselves of things without the factual basis for being convinced about them.
Right.
Yes. And we are easily self-misled, which makes us dangerous.
Yeah. And that's why I think something that you said earlier is very important. Perhaps the only universal moral or ethical principle is to constantly be rethinking and reconsidering your positions.
Which is what this fourth clue is about.
Yeah, exactly. So the fifth clue, it really throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing, right? It says, the indeterminate status of free will makes morality as a whole an uncertain issue. Mm-hmm. And this is the observer effect, which is in the quantum mechanical sort of similar principle. So the observer effect says, basically, you need an observer in order for a potential to become a reality. So before you look at something, a particle, for instance, if there's a particle, that particle exists in every potential state. But then when you look at the particle, it locks it into being a specific thing, which sounds crazy, but there is experimental evidence to show that this is what happens, right? And so with morality, the indeterminate status of free will, right? That's the way of saying, basically right now, in the next second, right? In the future that never comes, right? There is an infinite potential, right? Mm-hmm. You and I, the next word I say could be yellow, or in the next second, the earth could open up and swallow us. Or in the next second, aliens could come and beam us up, or whatever.
Or the AI has released one of the 5 scenarios. The AI releases on a global scale, releases the coffers, releases the Kraken, the biological creations that wipe us out in the space of hours. Universal plague, gone.
Yeah. So literally, in the future, there's literally infinite potential. Mm-hmm. Anything could happen. There's just varying degrees of probability of what will happen. Mm-hmm. But once the future is here, right? I've already said yellow. I've already said aliens. I've already said,
I had envisioned all kinds of things when you said it.
I've already said a lot of things in this episode that I wish I didn't say. But it's done. It's in the past. So now it is determined, right? And so with free will, our idea of free will, right? In the quantum mechanical universe, when we've talked in the past about the block universe or the expanding block universe, all these different things and their effect on it. But essentially, we don't know if we have free will or not. It sure feels like I do. It feels like I'm making decisions, but
it would.
Exactly. But if space and time are one thing, and if, the universe, if you zoom out far enough, the whole universe is there, then everything has already happened. So really, I'm just playing through a script, and therefore I don't have free will. The universe is determined. So if that's the case, then morality or ethics as a whole is really a moot point, right? Because nothing about it can be changed. We're just playing out the script. Yeah. So what do you think about that one?
I think that when he says, when they say that some argue that all our decisions are shaped by our evolution and the environment, or by previous physical events, so it's an illusion. I think I'm often convinced that could be the case, because I've read enough about consciousness and what we do and mostly don't know about it, and how the perception's reality thing, which means we mislead ourselves all of the time. Well, if we mislead ourselves that way, then it's entirely tenable that we mislead ourselves with the notion of ethics too.
Yeah, I think that you've hit on it there, which is, what we just talked about, which is that our perception informs reality, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think what that means is on the big scale, it seems that we mostly get it right. We'd like to think what we see as reality is mostly right. And every once in a while we fool ourselves and we're wrong. But as far as things being determined, I think that there is a certain amount that is determined because of biological limitations.
And ideological training.
Yes, biological limitations, ideological training, phylogenetic adaptation. All of these, there's a lot of forces and pressures that have been around since the beginning of humanity that have funneled our experience of reality into a narrow band, right? We've talked about it in the past all the time. We only see a sliver of the light spectrum. We only hear a sliver of the audio spectrum.
Right.
So there's no reason to think that our cognitive capacities are only able to examine a sliver of reality. And that sliver that we see, maybe we do get it mostly right. But that mostly right that we get it is akin to Newtonian physics, right? There's always that small quantum mechanical part, which would be, the stuff we get wrong, the chaos, boom, something pops up, something we can't explain, something that we are unable to comprehend that throws us for a loop, right?
Yeah.
And so, that one's an interesting question, and relating it from the quantum mechanical realm into the moral or ethical realm is really interesting to try to do, because I think that you come to this understanding that, kind of as we have talked about it with free will in the past, free will tends to be looked at as this polar argument. Either you have free will or you don't. But that's really probably not the case, right? There are probably a lot of things, and a lot of the big things, that are determined based off of what we mentioned.
We have free will to here's where I come in on this. We have free will to rethink our what do they call it? Spooky
spooky action at a distance.
Spooky actions at a distance, which is what Einstein was talking about. Just the phrase, what he felt about it. When we instantaneously judge something, if we don't think a little harder and then arrive at the same judgment. But if we don't think a little harder, then we're just acting according to what nature has taught us, or genetics. I think if we stop and think, which is hard and which is counterintuitive, because we are generally not rational beings, then we have taken an unnatural decision and exerted what I would call some free will. There'd be people countering me and say, no, that's built into your genetics too. Okay, fine. But for me, that's where the free will is most evident. And so that's also wishy-washy.
So do you think that this relationship between quantum mechanics and ethical morality is real, or do you think that it's just an example? So will a better understanding of quantum mechanics lead to a better understanding of ethics, or do you think that it's just sort of an imaginary correlation that we're drawing?
I think it's possible. I think it's much more helpful than the idea that this universality. I mean, it's not hard for me to think of something that I would want to be universal, and that's what Kant was saying. Think toward what you would have a universal principle be. But thinking toward what you would have a universal principle be means a whole lot of debating and conceptualizing and wrestling, and implies a process. I really think that the process is important. Quantum computing is an example of where the ethics discussion starts, where the phrase quantum ethics is out there. Quantum morality is yours. Quantum ethics is out there. But the nature of quantum computing, at least as a layperson can begin to grasp a little of it, is itself chaotic. It relies on a kind of frothy chaos, much like the surface of the ocean. very, very, very complicated. So is any idea of a sustainable ethics, because it's always going to be in motion. We find out at some point, we know that many people who are imprisoned wrongly. If we were going to just hold to the line and say, nope, they're in prison and therefore they're criminal, and it doesn't matter if we made a mistake, they're still going to be in prison, then most of us, I think, if we stopped and thought about it, would say, no, there's something really disquietingly unright about that process. And therefore, some people go after it, bless them, and try to undo the wrong by getting people out of prison and then is prison always the right thing? Nope. It's the easiest thing. Is prison made to rehabilitate? That's what we said, but it's not. And so on and so on. So the moment you start poking at that and it's not hard to see nope, this is goopy and wrong, and it was not solid the way we thought. That's where the quantumness, I think, comes into it. The fluidity comes into it, and we have the capacity to think our way through and say, no, we're making changes. I think that would be free will.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this idea, will advances in quantum mechanics result in advances in ethics? I think I want to lean towards saying yes, if for no other reason than for what we discussed in the episode about the 5 key elements to better rational thinking, right? Mm-hmm. Where he talked about breadth of knowledge, right? No matter how unrelated 2 fields seem to be, knowing something about one will give you some insight into another.
Okay, so knowing something about ant colonies gives you some insight into human motivation.
Right. Yeah, into ethics or morality.
And ethics or morality. But
and before, I don't know if King and King were the first ones, but before somebody came along, anybody else, myself, right, with my sort of uninterested view of ethics and morality, would never look at that and say, how does this relate to quantum mechanics, right? They seem so different that the thought would never occur. But to somebody, they thought about it and they looked at it and they found correlations, and then they developed this thing that gives us a keener insight into humanity. I think that is a key element of being a philosopher, right? Is taking 2 of anything and saying, you know what, I can draw some insights about one of these things just by knowing something about the other thing. And one of those key insights is going to be that you know so little about that one thing that you're going to have to be cautious in how you think about the other thing.
Did we share with each other this? There's something else I read this week that what you just said brings to mind. And it was a passage that was describing, maybe it was in the quantum computing ethics, describing how with ChatGPT or similar AI, they were monitoring the thought process because it was algorithmically programmed to reveal what it was, air quotes, thinking.
I didn't see this one, no.
I need to find this and send it to you because it's fascinating. Because the system lied by human standards to accomplish something that it wanted to accomplish. This was in the article about the 5 ways that AI could take us out, and it was a relatively small thing, but the narrative that the computer was saying, if I say this, then the human will not respond as I wish. But if I say this, then the outcome is likely. And the second this was a lie. And what happened was that the human did what the machine wanted. So it revealed that it was considering lying in order to... Now, does machine intelligence have free will? Or is it lying because the nature of that was built into it by the creators, us?
Right.
Do we have free will? Is deception built into us by a creator or the evolutionary process? Maybe.
Yeah, and this comes into another article that I sent you about quantum mechanics and psychology in the forms of consciousness and all kinds of different stuff. I'm sure we're going to be looking at these topics in some future episodes.
I think so.
It's really opened a door, and now there's a lot of interesting things to look at. But until next time, keep pondering.